Well, hello friends, Marcus D coming at you all with another video that I'm producing for the Great Questions group. And the title of this one is The 9 Mile Hole, okay? And it's actually going to be part one of a new little series that I want to produce that is going to be called Things Are Not Always As They Seem, okay? Because there are plenty of things like that I've discovered as I've gone on this Great Questions journey, this great questions quest, as I've called it, trying to find evidence that provided legitimate answers to those great questions. And so this one is actually, I'm going to be dividing it into two parts. And part one, I'm going to actually tell you the story of the 9 Mile Hole that I heard many years ago. I've shared it a number of times. I always put the disclaimer that I can't be definitively sure that this is true. Perhaps it's really not. Good possibility it may not be exactly true, but I found some evidence that I'm going to share in part two that definitely validates the theme behind this story. All right. And I'm also going to share some information that I have obtained, was given from some articles online too at the conclusion of this. But anyway, let's talk about the 9 Mile Hole. First of all, it deals with scientists' desire to be able to drill through the Earth's crust and take a sample of what's below it, which is called the mantle. All right. Now, I'm sure most of you are probably aware of this to a certain degree. All right. I'm sure most of you all have seen cutaways of the Earth like this. That actually show what we believe the interior to be like. And inside the globe, we have the inner core, as it's called. We have the outer core, as it's called. Then outside that, this orange stuff is what they call the mantle. And then right on top, this thinnest little portion is called the crust. That's the stuff we live on, all right? And folks, no one has ever actually been down here to check this out. This is all an inference based on scientists using something called seismology, where they bounce sound waves or vibrations through the earth. There's different ways they can do it, but then they can infer what's down in here. But no one really knows for sure because, again, no one's been down there to check it out. So the deal is scientists have wanted to. And so the point is, how do we get through this crust? Well, the crust compared to the rest of the Earth is quite thin, but it's really still fairly thick. It's been said that it ranges in average thickness from 3 miles to about 40 miles. All right. Now, what's interesting about that as well is the thinnest parts, the 3 mile parts, are under the ocean floor. And so for a long time, people thought, well, maybe the easiest way to try to do this is to go under, drill through the ocean floor. The problem is all the water on top, because those thin spots are in places in the ocean that are extremely deep. And that creates a whole new set of problems. As a matter of fact, I have here an old book. Many of y'all will probably recognize these. It was a Time Life series that we had when I was growing up. So this is actually from the 60s, the 1960s. But interestingly enough, in it, because I seem to remember this, I was fascinated by this stuff as a kid. It has a little excerpt in here about, and again, I know this is backwards, but it's about, drilling through the crust to get to the mantle. I think it actually says drilling down to the mantle. And you can see here what they're trying to do here is to test out if they had the ability to actually do it under the ocean. All right, so you can see this huge barge here. You see the picture of the captain trying to keep the barge still. And then you see some picture of some roughnecks that are kind of, there's the big drill that's going down. They had 3 miles of drill bits, 60-foot increments. And this, again, was in 1961. The challenge was trying to hold the ship still enough because of the currents and everything else, because they had to go down through over 2 miles of water, over 10,000 feet of water before they even hit the seafloor. And then they'd have to drill 3 miles beyond that. And at this point in time, they were saying that, if they're working on this, if they're able to do it, they should be able to drill into the crust by 1969. Well, that didn't happen. And as a matter of fact, they figured out it's too difficult to try to go do it, under the ocean, to go through all that seawater. So what they began, as the story goes, looking for is the shallowest spots on the earth. And according to this story, it was in a place in Siberia, in Russia. And so there was this scientific expedition of drillers and seismologists and geologists, and they found this spot. And the technology had developed, and this was in the late 80s, mid to late 80s, had developed to the point where they felt like they could literally drill through the crust. And what it was going to be was like 9 miles thick. They had to drill through 9 miles. Which was 40,000 feet-ish something. So the point is, they get these folks together, they go into Siberia, and they begin drilling. And one of the things that they noticed that they didn't expect was the fact that the temperature increased dramatically beyond what they expected it to. But the most bizarre thing was about the time they got down to where they felt like the crust should stop and the mantle should start in that range, something very surprising happened. And what happened, in fact, was that the drill bit broke free. There was no longer any resistance to the drill spinning, and there was no resistance to the drill going down. So they pulled the drill out, and then what they did was they dropped down the hole a microphone. And they began picking up sounds, but they weren't the type of sounds that they would expect when they were trying to listen to earth movements. So either they pulled the same microphone up and they were able to readjust it or retune it or reconfigure it, or they actually switched microphones, put a different kind of microphone and put it down and tuned in. And what they heard absolutely freaked them out, because what they picked up, much to their surprise and shock, was apparently human voices. In apparent agony, folks. In other words, wailing and gnashing of teeth. And what they felt like was they had inadvertently dug a hole into hell. And it so freaked the team out that the entire team quit. All right. And what it really was kind of an eye-opening, reality of what really is down, in the center of the earth. Now, again, disclaimer. I'm not saying this is true. I'm not saying the story is true. But it was such a compelling story that I would share it. And this was back in the day. We used to, when I was very active in the Amway business, we used to do these things called night owls. When we'd get together late at night after a meeting or something, we'd go out, have coffee and breakfast and stuff, and we'd sit around and talk about stuff. But then late night, we'd actually end up talking about interesting things, foundational things, sometimes spiritual things, and what was going on. And sometimes we'd actually call them light owls because they were shedding light into people's lives about some of these things. So I would talk a little bit about them, and just tell the story. Well, a couple of guys, and this was back in 1990, did some research online and actually found a couple of articles that actually talk about the story, that actually tell the story pretty much the way I just did. And what's interesting about it is, because it's been so long, I actually did some online research to try to find out if I could find any information, quote, on the 9 Mile Hole. The main thing that came up was now there's actually a place in Texas on a river that they call the 9 Mile Hole, which I found interesting. And there's other deep holes. There's nothing that you can find online. And again, I didn't do massive amounts of research because, again, that's not the point of this. There's nothing that talks about a hole in Siberia. There is one in Murmansk that was apparently drilled down to 7.5 miles. It's called the Kola Super Deep Borehole, apparently. But interestingly enough, that borehole has been sealed also. And the reason purportedly is because of lack of funds. Who knows what the deal is with that. But what's interesting is, and I also did some research. I looked it up. Wikipedia has a little bit on the hell hole, as it's called, Snopes, and they both said it's a hoax. It was a hoax. And what's interesting is when I read both of those reports, they have the first part of this article that I have, verbatim almost. That's what they posted. And it talks about, the first part of this article talks about what I just shared with you, but then it also talks about, without getting into all the details, certain aspects of it that were not true, and they were fabricated by somebody, this Norwegian person. And again, without getting into all the details on it, and that's what Snopes says, and that's what Wikipedia says. All right. But what's interesting is I have another part that was given to me on this story that neither Snopes nor Wikipedia has, that I was still able to find online, but I had to really, really dig down. And again, I have no idea whether any of this is true. But the reason I am sharing this is because, again, in part 2, I have a very, very interesting recount of reality, as I said, that does validate this. All right, but I want to read you some of this other article that Wikipedia and Snopes and nowhere else, again, unless I was able to dig, that I could find. And I'm going to let you, draw your own conclusions to this. But what's interesting is it actually talks about this Norwegian gentleman who thought this was a hoax until he went back to his own country. And apparently, his name was Randalin. Was in the United States when he heard some of these stories. When he returned to Norway, he was shocked to find that Norwegian newspapers were full of reports about the incident in Siberia. They reported the same information that had been reported on several religious networks and radio stations in America. The chief seismologist for this expedition was Barn J. Numedal, a Norwegian. An interview with Mr. Numedal was printed in Norway's largest and most respected newspaper. The following is excerpted from the article Mr. Randalin translated into English and sent it to this main person back here in the States that was on this network. Quote, Chief Geologist Numedal was given a gag order. The man who leaked the information about the recent seismological expedition to the Soviet and its shocking discoveries, Mr. Numedal, again, age 65, still fears for his life. Were he to go back to Russia, he would receive at least 15 years in prison. The discovery of human voices down that cavity so shocked the Soviets that at first they did not know what to do with the foreign crew members. If this had taken place in the Brezhnev era, I have no doubt that we would have been executed, says Mr. Numedal. We were all dismissed and sent out of the country 2 days after we struck that pocket in the interior of the earth. The Soviets greatly feared that we would spread the news of this discovery and threatened us with our lives if we did. Although the Soviet Union has undergone dramatic changes under Mikhail Gorbachev, remember this was in the 90s, folks, this article, the nation still remains firmly atheistic in orientation, and according to Mr. Numedal, the expedition's discovery was extremely unwelcome. The next day after the discovery, a spokesman from the Ministry of Religious Affairs in Russia called in the foreign crew members and outrightly offered us bribes. We all felt compelled to go along with it as we feared for our lives. When I came home, I donated the entire amount to charity. For the sake of the other crew members who have been unwilling to go public, Numedal will not reveal the amount of money handed out by the Soviets, but is believed to be a 6-digit number. What really unnerved the Soviets, apart from the voice recordings, which the ministry spokesman tried to dismiss as geological noise distortion, was the appearance that same night of a fountainhead of luminous gas shooting up from the drill site. Out of the midst of this incandescent cloud pillar, a brilliant being with bat wings revealed itself, with the words in Russian, "I have conquered," emblazed against the dark Siberian sky. The incident was absolutely unreal. The Soviets cried out in terror, says Mr. Numedal. Later that night, he saw ambulance crews circulating in the community. A driver he knew told him that they had been told to sedate everyone with medications known to erase short-term memory. The Soviets used this drug in the treatment of shock victims. When Mr. Randalin read these reports, he knew then that there was a hell and that he would end up in it. Fear gripped him, and for 2 nights he dreamed of seeing fires and hearing screams all night long. He finally committed his life to God. So, I didn't see this article anywhere. And again, folks, I'm not saying any of this, like I said, is true. But what I am going to do like I said, in part 2, is I'm going to read you something else that refers to this theme. And when it's interesting, when I came across that, I think God did use it to validate, again, the concept, the awareness. And because again, we tend to again take things for granted. We live on this planet, we walk around on its surface. Unless there's an earthquake or something like that going on, we don't really think about, again, what's going on, with this whole deal, especially what's going on, possibly within it. And I'll say this to you too. I'll reiterate this as I close this out, and again, I'll do part 2. And no one has been down to the below the crust. No one till this day that we know of has ever sampled a piece of the mantle, if there is such a thing. Again, it's all inferred. The only one who truly knows what's in the center of the earth is God. And it is interesting how he, in the scripture, it does talk a lot about hell being at the center of the earth, all right, for the time being. The scripture also talks about the fact that there are actually 2 hells, and we'll probably talk about that in another video in the future. But for right now, I'm going to close off this part, just something interesting to think about and reflect on. And in part 2, again, I'll share with you why I don't mind telling this story, even if in fact this specific story, if it is untrue. The reality of hell, the temporary one anyway, being in the center of the earth is in fact true. All right. And that's why, again, we want to avoid it. All right. And that's why I did those Great Questions Quest videos, that video series, which you can find at the Great Questions Group website online. All you got to do is search Great Questions Group and the blog will come up. It's also my name, markdemateo.com. They're also posted on YouTube. You go through those. It's why this God became the Savior, all right? And we need to know that so that we can avoid this place that was never meant for people, okay? So until next time, folks, Marcus D signing off. We'll be back in touch soon, okay? Take care. Bye-bye.